Hello. Welcome to my car. And the rain dropping outside. Very meditative. Yesterday's video, I thought I was going to be able to put more in there than I did. I got 10 minutes in and realized there's a lot more that I wanted to say. So yesterday's video, it's probably worth looking at if you didn't watch it. But we're going to cover more today about what I was talking about and why it's so important what I'm trying to convey here, which really, boils down to just be flexible and use whatever technique you want to use in order to feel better and to, manifest a better life and, manifest a better external reality as well. But as I mentioned yesterday, the priority is always how you feel internally, at least as far as I'm concerned. And if you feel better more of the time, it's quite natural that your external world is gradually going to change, especially if you're familiar with these LOA, law of assumption, whatever the heck you want to call them, principles that we always talk about. But what I was trying to get at yesterday, and again, there was just too much to unpack for one video, is that generally speaking, and we're going to be speaking in generalities here because this is too big a topic to get, overly into different, rare scenarios or unusual scenarios. But generally speaking, meaning most of the time, we look at Neville's or Joseph Murphy's advice, and a lot of it is about finding a feeling, getting into a feeling. Feeling is the secret, getting into a specific feeling, assuming a state, a specific state or feeling, and then doing our best to maintain that, right? I'm pretty sure that most people watching this understand that because you're probably very familiar with Murphy and Neville. If you're not, I've got about 6 million videos, a dozen books and, 85 plus podcast episodes that touch upon this, or at least, often touch upon Neville and Murphy. So it seems like, generally speaking, it's like assuming a specific feeling or state. And, the video I did a few days ago was about how a problem, especially like when you hear Neville's advice, is that people say just assume a state, as if it's very easy just to assume a state and that's it. And the truth of the matter is assuming a state is often quite difficult. It's often not something that we can maintain, in other words, so we might feel the release or the relief of being in the state we want. And then, we lose it, and then we try to get it back again. That is very, very different. That approach, that law of assumption, law of attraction approach, again, whatever you want to call it, is very different than the approach that David Hawkins talks about in Letting Go, and that people that do more emotional energy work often discuss. Yesterday, I referenced Victoria San's book, Bending Reality. And she has this great saying. She says, just feel whatever arises. Feel whatever arises. That seems totally different. Feeling whatever arises as opposed to feeling into a specific state. But what's so interesting is that both these approaches, which when we look at them intellectually seem to be opposite from each other, work in order to make us feel better. And they work to make us feel good if we do them. And that's something, excuse me, I'm just blowing my nose. That's something that is really interesting. Because it just goes to show why we can't be so dogmatic about only doing certain techniques if the technique's not working for us. Because two things that seemingly are opposite actually can end up leading to basically the exact same result. So I went so far as to write some notes today. just talking about why, or I just want to talk about why this is. And again, Victoria, I'm going to read one more passage from Victoria's book, Bending Reality, because she mentions it, okay? I would say that the reason that you can, attempt to assume a state and access that feeling, the reason that's in some strange way intellectually is the same thing as allowing every feeling in and feeling it fully, the way that like Hawkins talks about. The reason that you get the same result if you do either of those techniques, you could say successfully, is that when you do them, there's a sense of, and you get into them, you actually do them. Like when you assume a specific state, when you actually are in that state, when you're doing sats or you're repeating something like an affirmation over and over again until it feels real and you feel it. When you actually get to that feeling state, there's this sense of relief. It's like, oh, I am it. And there's that release when that happens, that release and relief. And we've often discussed this. Neville is a master at explaining this. Oh, everything's fine. I already am it. And when you do a exercise, an energetic exercise like David Hawkins talks about, or like Victoria Son talks about in this Bending Reality book, feel whatever arises, you're feeling into these uncomfortable feelings. You're feeling into them. And it can be very uncomfortable at first, but you don't label with your mind what you're feeling. You just feel it. And you basically ignore the thoughts associated with the feeling, because those thoughts are not what's real here. What is really happening right now when you're doing an exercise like this are the feelings that come up. So you just pay attention to the feelings, and you pay more and more attention to them. And these feelings that at first might seem overwhelming become less so, and then they dissipate. They release. You let them go. Naturally, they let go of you. And just like when we're trying to assume a specific state, we have this same sense of release and relief when all this discomfort, all these overwhelming feelings, we feel into them and then they just disappear. There's this huge amount of relief and release and feeling good. Both these techniques, assuming a feeling, assuming a state, and allowing whatever feeling we have to be there until it releases, both of those practices make us feel good. They make us feel fulfilled in the moment because we feel this relief. William Burroughs, the writer, he had this great line. I think it was he was the person who said it. He says, all pleasure is relief. And that's almost what this is like. It's like, oh, I'm fine. I'm free. I already have what I want on a deep inner level right now. Assuming a state gives you that when you do it. And letting go, like Hawkins talks about, gives you that when you do it. So let me read you this excerpt again. I read this part yesterday. I'm going to read one more paragraph as well from Victoria's book because it ties this together nicely. She wrote, this client made the connection between his current day frustration and not getting his way with the fear he had growing up from not being able to stand up for himself and the sadness of feeling helpless. As an adult, when he feels helpless, he gets angry. This pattern leads him to feel stressed and anxious whenever he doesn't get his way. In my experience, there are few pure business problems. There are many personal patterns that show up in how we conduct business. By going deeper, we solve tactical issues in the short term, and we also resolve the underlying patterns that solve these challenges in the long term. So she's saying that, these feelings that make us very uncomfortable, that's our real business, okay? It's not a business problem we're dealing with. It's not an external problem we're dealing with in our life as much as it's an internal problem in how we deal with these feelings. And that we can release them feel into them and release them, and it will end up solving these external problems. The business of our life will start to get easier, right? And you can also release them by assuming an ideal state, the state you want. That's another way to release the current feelings of fear you have, is to assume the state like Neville and Murphy talk about. So the next paragraph, Victoria writes, how wound up the nervous system is, how severe the contraction is, and how much energy is bound up in this old memory story cell tissue will determine the process, technique, and timing of the release. Sometimes it's a conversation. Sometimes it's no words and it's movement. Sometimes it's sound or breath. This is why I'm tool and modality agnostic. I move at the pace of the nervous system. This enables me to expand my client and remove contraction without triggering disbelief, resistance, or a short circuit. I love this paragraph. What she's saying is, don't get tied to one technique. Anything that will allow you to feel that release. Whether it's by doing SATs or affirmations to assume a state and feel it, to get that sense of release and relief. Whether it's by feeling into feelings and letting go, like Hawkins talks about, to get that sense of release. Or whether it's a conversation. A conversation can be a self-conversation, like we always talk about. Talking out loud to yourself. If you talk out loud to yourself successfully, you feel stressed out, you start talking out loud to yourself. If you do it in the way that I talk about, you will feel a release. And it's like, everything's fine. Sometimes it's no words and it's movement, she writes here. It's nonverbal. And, I always talk about like the joy of not thinking, moving around, jumping up and down, making silly faces. Sometimes it's movement that gives you that sense of release. In my experiences, nothing can get you that sense of release quicker than, vigorous movement, playful, vigorous movement, especially when you feel bad. If you start jumping around like a monkey for a minute or two, even if you feel really anxious and bad, you're going to get a sense of release if you really 100% physically get into your movement. Sometimes it's sound or breath, making noises, sound, to get that release. Even, that can be music, listening to music, or it could be making noises yourself, like, as much as a joke the hello is, it's also like when you do noises like, there is release there by doing that. Or breath work, doing breath work, breathing work, becoming conscious of the breath. You do that, I've done a fair amount of that before. I've been into Wim Hof stuff for years. You do that, and that can provide you a release. All these modalities provide you a release. And she says, that's why I'm tool and modality agnostic. I move at the pace of the nervous system. I love that so much. I really appreciate Victoria San writing that in her book, Banning Reality. I, too, am tool and modality agnostic. And I hope that this video and the previous video and the videos we've been doing have explained to you why I think it's important to be tool and modality agnostic. Use whatever is working for you today, right now. It can be different tomorrow. That's fine. Use what works. That's all that's important. Accept what you want to use, utilize it, and you will get to that point of release and feel good more often. And here is the trash truck, as if on cue. All right, any questions? RadicalCounselor.com.